Okay, so first a note of apology because I thought that I sent you the illegal PDF copy of the book already. Then I realized that it was not in files on Canvas, so you haven't received that. I haven't sent you the book before via email. I haven't. You didn't have it. Okay, so I posted it now in file. Hopefully that all of you got the message via Canvas, so it's not a problem if you haven't read the first two chapters today, it's okay. So we're going to be using this book that, this is my book, Hungarian Microeconomics, Forgotten Anglo-American Contribution to Austrian Economics. We're going to be reading significant part of it as a supplementary material, as a secondary literature. We will be reading also the original sources to some degree. You don't have, the reason why I eventually had to do this unpopular thing to assign my own book is that this is the only book that covers this stuff as a history of economic thought. You can find here or there some isolated mentions of this theory, but it's not covered in great detail. So I wanted us to cover this tradition, at least those 4 economists, and one more that I forgotten to print the outline of that you can find on the website that I linked, Frank Knight, another one. I want us to study these 4 or 5 guys in great detail because they contributed mightily to economic theory, and the only kind of acceptable secondary literature overview of them as a tradition is this book. So that's the reason, and additional reason that I know my book better than I organize it itself, so then it's easy for me to help you understand what is going on by using my own template. So that's it. I will be posting as we go along further reading starting from next Tuesday. So we'll see whatever chapter is in the book, I will adjust the primary literature. So chapter 3 we will read probably. It's gonna be Wicksteed and Frank Knight. I will post the readings. So next time we will read Philip Wicksteed and Frank Knight, and then as we go along, John Bates Clark later on and Frank Vetter. So the book is organized thematically, so I'll explain you what we're going to do now until the end of the semester. So there is some general topics that this school of thought, I'll tell you something in general about them. What justifies their classification as a separate school of thought. So the book is organized into some 6 or 7 different thematic lines. So the chapter 3 is the theory of opportunity costs, how those guys develop theory of cost. That's the theory that we read nowadays in all the textbooks. They were responsible for the decisive formulation of that theory that improved on what Menger and Ben Bawerk said earlier. So all of them, pretty much all of them are right in the tradition of Menger and Ben Bawerk. In a certain sense, you can call them the American or Anglo-American continuation of the Austrian school of economics. But in many respects, they improve upon the analysis of Menger and Ben Bawerk. And they improve it in a variety of ways. The first one is the opportunity cost theory. Completely subjective opportunity cost theory. The Frank Knight and Davenport and Philip Wicksteed are the main thinkers here. Then the theory of distribution. With the first formulation of the marginal productivity theory of factor incomes. This theory that you learn in microeconomics. Marginal productivity of labor determines wages and so on. This entire theory was formulated by John Bates Clark and Philip Wicksteed, and we will read their articles or some small parts of the book by John Bates Clark that formulate this theory. theory of interest, the pure time preference theory of interest. Remember the time preference, interest, weighting, compensation for weighting. We'll now see how Fetter and Fisher corrected and improved on Ben Bauer's theory of interest. Theory of entrepreneurship. We'll cover both Wicksteed and Fetter, and to some degree Frank Knight as well. Okay, so that's the theory of cost, entrepreneurship, theory of interest, and theory of distribution, marginal productivity, theory of factoring. So these are some of the major topics covered by those economists that we are going to be studying in the next 2 or 3 weeks at least. So you haven't read the first introductory chapter from the book. It's okay. I'll just summarize you what it's all about, why I actually decided to write the book and what prompted it, and why I think that might be relevant for us as we look back to the early history of early American economic thought. That the main breakthrough that came along with the Austrian economics was the establishment of the subjective theory of value and marginal utility analysis. That was a big revolution that happened in the 1870s in Europe. We learned later on that in parallel with that, something similar was going on in America already. The John Bates Clark, this guy here, discovered the principle of marginal utility independently from Menger in Austria, Jevons and Valra in England and Switzerland, respectively. By the way, nowadays, one of the most prestigious economic awards for economists younger than 40 or 45. People say it's more difficult to get that award than Nobel Prize in economics. So John Bates Clark medal. John Bates Clark is one of the biggest names in American economics in general. Irving Fisher, maybe, and Frank Knight is the most famous and celebrated American economists. So he discovered the principle of marginal utility completely independently 7 or 8 years later, I think in 1882, in his book, Philosophy of Wealth. That's the co-discovery of marginal utility. During 1880s, the Austrian theory with Ben Bauer's appearance on the scene, the Austrian theory became very widely accepted in Europe and in America. So Ben Bauer wrote in English, he read and wrote in English, so he started publishing his stuff in American journals, the Journal of Political Economy and American Economics Review, journals established around that time, and the Austrian ideas became known to American economists. American economics professions just were coming of age in 1880s, 1890s. There were very few economists at that time to begin with. Many of people who taught economics in 1880s were actually professors of law or philosophy. There was no economic profession, strictly speaking. It's the beginning of economics as a professional field. The Austrian economics became maybe the predominant tradition in America. Unlike some European countries, including England, where marginalism, this Menger, Valra, Jevons marginalist subjectivist theory was buried behind another revolution that happened with Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall is a very important British economist. Who is known for trying to reconcile marginalist theory with the old theories of Ricardo and Adam Smith, with the classical economics. He wanted to reconcile, because obviously you remember when we talked about Menger, that it meant turning the upside down the entire theory of value and price established by the classical theory. It's the cost of production theory of prices, the labor theory, and so on. This entire theoretical edifice of classical economics has been overturned by the marginalist revolution. Now, in Austria, this revolution was embraced. And in some parts of continental Europe, we'll see. In Sweden as well, interestingly enough. It was embraced. In England, it was not embraced. Now, there are various reasons for that. The primary one being that certain sense of British nationalism and national pride, and with some undertones of British jingoism. Classical economics were their brainchild. Classical economics was an economics written by Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and James and John Stuart Mill. It was their thing. It was considered British political economy even nowadays, especially Germans who were jealous of British prestige at that time in many fields. This is a British political economy. So it shouldn't shock you then that the British wouldn't like very much that the three continental European economists claimed to have overturned everything that the British economists have written for 100 years, eventually. 1776, The Origins of Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. 1873, Menger's Principles of Economics, and Bauraz and Jevons books in 1873. So 100 years of classical economics have been overturned essentially at its deepest core, theory of value and price. Now, Alfred Marshall was leading the counter-revolutionary forces, and Alfred Marshall strove to show that this marginalist theory is just one that it corresponds to and explains only one side of the market. You have the forces of supply and demand. The forces of demand are determined by marginal utility, and he accepts that. Okay, I have to concede subjective evaluations on the margin and subjective references determine the demand schedules. By the way, he invents the concepts of demand and supply curves. That's Alfred Marshall's technical invention, among many other things. The elasticity of demand, if you remember from microeconomics, it's all Alfred Marshall. This entire diagrammatical, can we use that term? This diagrammatic mode of economic analysis is Marshall's. Now, he said, okay, but that's just part of the story. The second and even more important part of the story is something that we've forgotten from classical economics. That means that the prices on the market are not determined only by subjective utility and scarcity and marginal evaluation. They're determined also by the costs of production. And by costs of production, he meant that something called real costs, like the true sacrifice, the true labor toil that people have to undergo in order to produce anything. So those cost determinations of prices operate in the long run, whereas the consumer unpredictable preferences influence it in the short run. So you remember now you face the same thing with Smith, with Ricardo, with Turgot, with Cantillon. So they are short-term, long-term normal prices that are determined by the cost of production, and short-term quirks and fluctuations determined by unpredictable changes in consumer demand. So he formulated this famous concept that the prices are determined that you need both blades of a scissor in order to cut the paper. By the same token, you need both supply and demand to cut the price, to determine the price at the intersection of the supply and demand curves in order to understand the phenomenon of price. So this subjectivist, marginalist theory that it's only like a scarcity of goods in our subjective references, that's the only thing that determines prices, is too simple-minded, too simplistic. We need to take into account the costs of production, to take them into account, to use them to explain the phenomenon of prices. So he developed this in his textbook, Principles of Economics, in 1890. call it this neoclassical synthesis, that he revived the classical economics, said that the bigger part of classical economics was okay, and marginalist subjectivist theory was taken just as one relatively less important part of the economic synthesis. So this became the predominant view among British economists. So later on, his student was a guy called Arthur Cecil Pigou, main student of Arthur Marshall. He is known, anyone knows what Pigou was most famous for? His theory of externality, external costs. It is widely used now in environmental economics, this idea that you have some cost that somebody imposes on the third parties that this person doesn't pay for, and it has to be compensated for. External cost. CO2, people emit CO2, nobody pays for the environmental and ecological damages that are created thereby, so we need then to compensate society by enacting taxes to punish the perpetrators and to subsidize the victims of environmental damage. So his students are Arthur Cecil Pigou, they're student of both of them, actually. I think that he read Pigou, but just took one course of economics with Alfred Marshall, was John Maynard Keynes. You know who the guy is. So he studied philosophy and mathematics and history. He's a polymath. Keynes was a genius, actually, but he, as Hayek, his good friend, Hayek testified, he was not very well educated in economics. The only course in economics is one class that he took with Alfred Marshall. That's everything that he essentially knew about economics from a scholarly, from a schooling point of view. And all three of these guys were convinced that the British tradition of classical economics is the most important thing. If you learn Cambridge economics, there is nothing else worth learning in economic theory. So they largely ignored the biggest part of the marginalist revolution that happened in Europe. And they started to influence their influence of Alfred Marshall was a very concise writer, and this textbook was very popular. It started to spread later, much later in America, but in other continental Europe. This Marshallian revolution took place. Marshallian economics became more and more popular. By the way, modern microeconomics textbooks are maybe 60–70% Marshall's, the content of his principles of economics, just simplified for its purpose, of course. So the entire analysis of supply and demand and the interpretation, most interpretations of the supply and demand curves, elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply, and many other technical points of analysis. That's all Marshall. Even the concept of external costs, externality and internal cost, was taken from Marshall. The concepts of rents and quasi-rents that some of the best textbooks in modern economics use, they're terribly misguided. They're taken from Marshall. On the other hand, the nature, you might think then that the Menger and Ben Bauer were the opponents of this, that they were the polar opposites of Marshall. But the problem with Menger and Ben Bauer was that they haven't completed their revolution. It's an incomplete revolution. By revolution, I mean marginalist revolution, this reformulation of the entire edifice of economic theory based on the principles of scarcity, marginal utility, and subjective theory of value. What they succeeded in doing, they succeeded in formulating a pretty good theory of consumer behavior, consumer decision making, all of these sacks of corn examples demonstrating that the prices of consumer goods are determined by marginal evaluations of consumers. So Menger and Bauer did an excellent job in doing that. So theory of consumer behavior, as we call it nowadays in microeconomics textbooks. Just consumer behavior. They succeeded. But what they haven't succeeded in doing are a couple of things. Primarily, what remained in a flux was the theory of production. How to apply marginal utility theory and subjective theory of value to the theory of production. That was a big question mark. You'll see that they developed some concepts that can help us think about production in terms of subjective utility, but they haven't completed the entire theory that explains in detail how it works, how production, to the level of minutiae, to the level of detail that they did with consumer theory. It was nowhere near as complete. So theory of production. Kind of semi-demi 20%, 23%-ish developed. They simply gave us some of the ideas how to think about it, but haven't developed full theory. Another thing that remained in flux was the theory of interest. Theory of interest, profit, entrepreneurship. So it was a big step in the direction of subjectivism, but just a half step from a historical point of view. A large part, significant part of economic theory was not touched by the marginalist revolution. And that's what allowed Marshallian revival of the classical cost of production theories to gain ground, to gain supporters, to gain acceptance among academic economists, because the alternative to Marshall's point of view was still not well developed. This theory that says, no, we have to abandon completely cost of production theories, and this fiction about supply and demand as two independent forces was not developed yet. Austrians didn't develop it. Theory of production, I just remind you that you have some beautiful principles already at the general level developed by Menger and Bauer. You remember the theory of imputation and this suction pump model of economics that Bauer used. Remember that when we read Bauer, we haven't read that particular passage, but I told you about it. You remember this relationship between the prices of lower order and higher order goods, the relationship between the prices of consumer goods and producer goods. So already Menger sees that the theory of cost of production, there is something fishy about it, but that we cannot explain the prices of producer goods by invoking costs of production, that we have to do something else. So this theory of imputation that says that the prices of the goods of higher order, which means goods that are farther away from the consumer stage, from the stage of producing consumer goods, is determined by the prices of lower order goods, the goods that are closer to the consumption stage. And that eventually the prices of consumer goods determine the prices and the value of producer goods. So the value is imputed backwards from human minds and preferences and evaluations to consumer goods, and from consumer goods further to producer goods. So it goes in this vertical. Consumers here, in their preferences, here would be all kinds of hierarchy of gradation of different goods, beginning here with raw materials and labor as a fundamental goods, and then you go in an entire succession of stages of production of different goods. So all of those goods that are further below in the structure of production, they gain their value from the value of the goods that are above them. So why fertilizer is a price on the market? Why anybody decides to pay the price of fertilizer? It's not because it costs too much to produce fertilizer, but because fertilizer is somewhere along the chain of producing wheat, grain. It's used to fertilize the land to increase the crop yield. And then why the crop yield is something that people would worry about, because the grain is something that you could sell on the market, that you can sell on the market. Why can you sell grain on the market? Because grain is used to produce bread flour. Why would anyone want to buy bread flour? Because they can use it to make bread. Why anyone would like to make bread? Because bread is useful for consumer to eat. So this is the beginning. But when you look at this sequence in the temporal sequence of events, you start here. Time goes in this way. See, production process begins with planting the seeds, working the land. And then you engage in the processes that are closer in time to the final consumption stage. Wherever harvest is here, let's say. And here is consumption, or final sale of bread. So see, in time, you go from here to there. But in the logical sequence, in what causes what, you go backwards. Future consumer prices determine present costs that you pay for producing something. Why people pay for fertilizer, why a farmer will pay for the fertilizer. What is the real causal agent here is the future price of grain that he will sell on the market. So future speculative, possible, expected, hoped for prices are the true causes of why we pay any cost right now to do anything. So that's something that Menger and Ben Bawerk already qualitatively developed in a beautiful sense, this psychological. That's the reason why this theory is christened by the American followers of Ben Bawerk, psychological. Because the psychological, let's say, realities are the true causal agents of economics. Our psychological states of minds, our expectations, our hopes, our preferences is what moves the economic, the real physical rules, what directs production. Now, we have all of that. So that's a kind of semi-step in the direction of subjectivism. It shows how subjective states of mind determine objective costs. What is missing here is the final step explaining in detail prices of producer goods by using the instrumentary, the instruments of marginal utility analysis. That was not provided by Menger and Ben Bawerk. So, the prices of consumer goods are determined by marginal utility. How to think of prices of producer goods in some analogous fashion, so as to how to apply the marginal theory to production, marginal utility. To production. That was the last step that they needed to do in order to subjectivize theory of production. And I gave you this entire introduction just to prepare the ground for saying that this American school, this American branch of the psychological school, that they did this. They completed the revolution in many respects by developing subjectivist theory of production, of distribution, of interest. So now, if you look at how Austrian economics is thought about nowadays, it's something like this. You have Menger and Ben Bawerk, the founders of the school, and you have Friedrich von Wieser, who was of Ben Bawerk's generation. They were actually brothers-in-law, Wieser and Ben Bawerk. Then you have the next generation where Ludwig von Mises and Joseph Schumpeter come along. Everything is happening in Austria in the early part of last 2 decades of the 19th century, the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Then Mises comes along in 1912, his big book, Theory of Money and Credit, Schumpeter's Theory of Business Cycle, the Theory of Economic Analysis in 1913, years later. And then you have younger men who come along after 1918, Fritz Machlup, Gottfried Haberle. Most of them will immigrate to America after the First World War, before Hitler or after Hitler took over Austria as liberals and the enemies of the German people. Most of them will immigrate, almost all of them will immigrate to America. Just Gottfried Haberle, Fritz Machlup, and another one, maybe the most famous one, F.A. Hayek. They were this third generation of Austrian economists, students, mostly students of Ludwig and pupils of Ludwig von Mises in Austria. All of them immigrate. Hayek goes in 1931 to England, where he encounters this Marshallian orthodoxy ruling, and he and Lionel Robbins introduce European continental Austrian economics and the London School of Economics, and they convert the elite of British economists into the sort of Misesian, Ben Bawerkian theory very quickly. And he delivers his famous speech, a series of talks that are later on called Prices and Production, and published as a book, Prices and Production, for which he will get the Nobel Prize in economics in 1974. So that's 1931, 32. Hayek is 31 years old by that time. Mises would go to Switzerland first. From Switzerland, he will move to America. In America, Austrian economics is nowadays mostly confined and most present in America. And most American Austrians are students of another man, or two others, students of Ludwig von Mises in America, Murray Rothbard and Israel Kirzner. And this is the storyline that people say. The first generation, Menger, Ben Bawerk, Wieser. The second generation, Schumpeter, Mises. Third generation, younger pupils of Mises like Hayek, Machlup, Haberle, and so on. Mises immigrates to America, finds new pupils, Rothbard, Kirzner. Rothbard and Kirzner publish their works, and many of their pupils and students and followers and readers become the followers of Mengerian, Ben Bawerkian, Misesian Austrian. And that's the story. It's a direct transmission from Austrian masters. Even Hayek will spend some time in America in 1950s and so on. But essentially, Mises and Hayek as the main transmission belts of this Viennese school of economics to America, the Western world. And now there is one big gap here. It's 40 years that are forgotten, maybe longer. That there is an Austrian school in America, but which is homegrown, which is in debate with the European currents of thought. They read Ben Bawerk and Menger, they debate with them, but they're a completely independent school of thought. These are Irving Fisher, Herbert Davenport, Frank Knight, John Bates Clark, Frank Vetter, and Philip Wicksteed in England.
I was kind of confused. What do you mean by, like, in your introduction, by casual realist analysis of the market process?
Oh, causal realistic.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll explain that. So, causal, analysis. That's the Mengerian approach. Causal realist. First, the causal part. The opposite of causal here is, mathematicians will know this better. It's a tradition that emerges with Leon Bonrat. It says it's not productive in economics to try and disentangle what causes what. There is a concept of mutual determination of everything. That everything determines everything else, and our ordinary concept of causality is inapplicable to economic theory. Whereas in Austrian economics, here you see this idea of causal influence, that our conceptions that we have in our minds determine what is going to happen in reality. And one more thing here. The type of causality that Austrians develop and emphasize is not the causal relationship of this kind of mechanical sort. One billiard ball hits another one and the other one keeps moving. A Newtonian, by the laws of Newtonian mechanics. It's not the mechanistic causality, it's the Aristotelian teleological. So this concept of causality is teleology. Teleological causality. Telos being the purpose, the aim, the goal. So what is the true causal agent in economics is our purposes and the goals and aims that we have in our mind. Of course, speculative, expected, guessed about purposes and goals. What purposes and goals? So causal here contains psychological and teleological. The goals that individual consumers have are the real causes of economic action. That's this process that I explained. So that's the causal part. The realist part is that they want to explain real prices in the real world, not hypothetical prices. That's one difference between, if you read the chapter 2, you will see this difference between Jevons's and between Jevons's concept of marginal utility and Menger's concept of marginal utility. They seem identical at the surface, but when you look more deeply, they're not. Because what Menger means by marginal utility is an increment in value that you get by one additional unit of consumption. So economic goods, economic action is always real in the sense it's discrete. It's always one relevant unit of consumption, one additional good. Marginal utility is a utility of an additional quantity, additional discrete, finite quantity of a given good, which is tangible, which is on a human scale, always. Could not be infinitely small. The concept of infinitely small increment or decrement is nonsensical in Hungarian. So that's another, realist means we deal with the real physical goods and services and with the real relationships of consumption and production. Whereas in Jevonsian and Walrasian formulation of marginal utility, you have it's a mathematical function that could be infinitely small. You can integrate the function into infinitely small steps. It looks like a smooth curve. So that's utility, which is not realistic in a sense, because there's nothing realistic about the concept of an infinitely small change. There is no infinitely small change in the field of human action. That's what the Austrians would say. I'm not saying that this Mengerian approach is better than Jevonsian. I'm just saying that what is the essence of the argument that you cannot use mathematical functions to explain marginal utility. Because marginal utility is something that is discrete, separate, cannot be integrated into one function. So that's what causal realist means. You can translate it into kind of subjectivist, purposeful realist. So in economics, we very often use those artificial constructs of models, idealized kind of images of the economic process. And sometimes even the Austrians use those images. You'll see many of them later. Concept of evenly rotating economy or the momentary equilibrium and so on. The fictitious states of affairs that don't exist in reality, but could help us to understand certain aspects of economic process. But the final goal is never just to use those models. The final goal is always to understand the real prices that happen in the real time and place in reality. So that's what causal realistic analysis. Yes, does this make sense? Any other questions? So it's a good question insofar as this causal here has a different meaning than you would usually think in the context of natural science. It's kind of subjective, proposal, teleological understanding, and realist is a kind of critical commentary about the use of mathematics in economics. Mathematical economics deals with abstractions, like infinitely small steps. They are conceivable mathematically and logically, but they could not be demonstrated in action. That's another formulation. Only those things are relevant for economics as a science of human action that could be demonstrated in action. You cannot demonstrate an infinitely small increment in utility. It has to be finite, not infinite, finite. Small, maybe, but on human scale, whatever that might be. One glass of water. So it's a utility of a marginal unit, of an additional sip of water or glass of water, whatever you want to be your unit, depending on the state of your body. Sometimes it could be, if you're not very thirsty, a sip of water could be a marginal unit. If you're very thirsty, maybe a glass of water could be a relevant unit. But it has to be some finite unit which is matched with the characteristics of human action at a point in time. Whereas the infinite, like this mathematical marginal utility, would be infinitely small marginal utility, which is divorced completely from realistic conception of human action. That's what is the critical edge of this theory. Economics is a study of human action, as Mises would like to say. Mises wrote a gigantic book of 900 pages. It's about economics, the entire economic theory, as he understood it. It's called human action. Because that's what economics is, just a part of the theory of human action, a logical, philosophical structure of human action and consequences of human action. So if you disregard this, and human action is always human action in space and time with discrete objects, physical or otherwise. So now you have that guy, F.A. Hayek. Any other questions? That's fine. F.A. Hayek. Now, this should be one of those guys who directly transmitted Austrian economics from Vienna to England and America in 1930s. Mises comes in 1941. So Austrian economics was buried. Ben Bawerk dies in 1914. He was a minister of finance in Austro-Hungary. And he dies of heart attack the day when the war with Serbia began. Can you imagine when he realized how much this will cost? He withdraws from academic economics much before that. He spends the last 15 or 16 years of his life in public service. In government, he doesn't write very much in economics. Menger retires. He refuses to allow reprint of his book, which reaches some astronomical price on secondary market. It's out of print, essentially. So the claim is that Austrian economics dies by the 1914. As soon as it
begins to revive with Mises and Schumpeter. The First World War begins. Later on, Hitler comes along, 1932, 1933. And it is really revived as a school of thought in America in 1940s when Mises comes along and when Hayek comes in England in 1930s. That is the second wave of Austrian economics. Now, there is one interesting biographical story. I begin the chapter 1 with F.A. Hayek gives an interview to Armen Alchian. You will remember who Armen Alchian was if you took micro course with me. He's the writer of the textbook that we used. He's a great American economist, one of the best economists who never got a Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, died a year or two ago. And Alchian asks Hayek, says, "You were in America before 1920?" He says, "Oh yes, I was there." He traveled in 1922, 1923 to America. Why did Hayek travel to America? He said, because the best economists of that time were in America, people who debated with Menger and Ben Bauer, like John Bates Clark and Nixon Carver and Herbert Davenport and Frank Fetter. I wanted to learn more from them. So what would Hayek, who was the student of Ludwig von Mises in Vienna, would want to learn from American professors in 1923? Now we'll see what he wanted to learn and what he learned actually from them at that time. So Hayek says another interesting thing. So you see now that there is an entire tradition which is missing from those mainstream narratives of how this Mengerian Ben-Bawerkian theory got transferred from fin de siècle Vienna to modern America and modern England and the Western world. He says every progress in economic science in the last 60 years, or whatever the number of years was a step in the direction of greater subjectivism. That means every progress in economic theory was always a progress in applying more thoroughly and more consistently principle of subjective theory of value. And that's exactly what this American group did. That was their major contribution to economic theory that got forgotten eventually in America itself, which is a shame, a pity. But it got forgotten because Marshallian economics conquered America in 1930s, especially 1940s, became the predominant view in microeconomics. Most American economists studied Marshall and Milton Friedman. I remember Milton Friedman, you know who Milton Friedman was, the dean of the Chicago School of Economics, considered the most pro-free market economist in America, one of the most pro-free market economists in America. And I remember his interview for the Icelandic television in 1970s, after he got the Nobel Prize. He said, look, there are two types of economics. Walrasian economics, Leon Walras, this Swiss-Italian school. Leon Walras, Pareto, Alfredo Pareto is another one here. This is generally equilibrium theory. It's heavily mathematical economics. And there is a Marshallian economics, which is more down to earth, more common sense, less mathematical. I belong to this Marshallian economics. He completely obliterated Mengerian. For him, that didn't exist anymore. Although some of the best American economists of the period between roughly 1890 and 1925 were self-declared Austrians and Mengerians and Ben-Bawerkians. And insofar as they debated Menger and Ben-Bauer, they criticized them for not pushing this marginalist subjectivist revolution far enough. As Fetter explicitly declared himself to be an Austrian, Davenport as well, Wicksteed in England and so on. So now this tradition completely got lost from the mainstream American economics profession and also from the history of the Austrian school to which they belong, in a certain sense, in a very direct sense. So now we're going to try and see their concrete contributions. We're also going to see to what extent and for what reasons this school disappeared. Why it's been forgotten. I said here's the forgotten Anglo-American contribution to the Austrian school. A part of the story is that the Marshallian economics and Keynesianism later on came to dominate the academy, and these guys were on the opposite side of this new historical tide. They didn't fit. So that's nothing new and nothing spectacularly unexpected to have one unpopular school of thought that eventually will be forgotten or downplayed because it didn't fit the prevailing spirit of the time. They prevailed. The second and the more idiosyncratic reason was that they were at war with each other, all of these guys. They couldn't stand one another. Fetter and Davenport were big enemies. Then Fetter and Fisher as well. All of them were terribly jealous, and some of them were, actually none of them developed a school of thought. They didn't have many talented students who continued their work. So that's one of the important things in modern marketplace of ideas, is that you create sufficient number of talented followers who will carry on with your research, who may criticize you at some point, but who will advance your research paradigm, your research program. They didn't have that. There was a complete breakdown. In 1920s, when most of these guys came off the scene, got retired and so on, economics as such was in America under a terrible assault. Any type of theoretical economics under the onslaught of this new institutionalist thinking. Sociology essentially came to replace it, and economics became out of touch at that time. Much less popular 1920s, 1930s. That's one factor. And another factor that when economics, insofar as economics remained relevant, it was Marshallian economics, and later Keynesian economics in the macro level. So then you will see that the entire Austrian economics, because it was didn't fit this Marshallian paradigm, it was simply erased out of existence, and then its American progeny, its American representatives were also erased. So you have this weird situation in which you have John Bates Clark medal, whereas John Bates Clark's theory was downplayed. As John Bates Clark kind of, you can say, was not completely forgotten, but Herbert Davenport, Frank Fetter, so Philip Wicksteed in England, maybe the most talented out of them all, completely forgotten. And these are, I must say, I have some experience in reading history of economics. These guys are some of the most talented economists that you can find anywhere, before or after. One more note of caution here. You shouldn't think that Austrian economics equals apology of free markets. That's the way how it is understood nowadays, for a variety of reasons, but there is nothing in the principles of economic theory that of necessity will require you to subscribe under any particular political philosophy. So one of the reasons why this identification exists nowadays is that the most modern contemporary Austrian economists are indeed free market people, radical free market. Most of them, some of them are even anarchists. Murray Rothbard was a student of Ludwig von Mises, and he was an anarchist. He accused Mises himself of being statist because Mises was against abolishing the state altogether. So most of modern American Austrians are students and followers of Murray and Rothbard, so they're very radical in this right-wing, libertarian, even anarchist direction. However, the early Austrian economists, they were not particularly free market. Karl Menger was a kind of classical liberal. Ben Bawerk was a semi-social democrat, social liberal, the middle of the road, wishy-washy, non-ideological guy, essentially. Friedrich von Wieser was a socialist. Now, the American group, you look at their political allegiances. You have in those summaries something about their political views of many of them. Frank Vetter was middle of the road, like a Ben Bawerk style, semi-liberal, social democratic, left-wing liberal. Herbert Davenport too. John Bates Clark was a little bit more to the right later on, but he began as a semi-socialist himself, and then got disappointed in socialism, and eventually wrote his major book, which is usually considered as an ethical and moral justification of the free markets and free market distribution. We'll talk about it. He was not particularly like a laissez-faire either. Philip Wicksteed was maybe, as I said, the most talented of them all. Was a socialist. At some point, he even advocated for the socialist revolution. Later on, he was a pretty much left-wing. He was a Methodist minister. So. One connection that sometimes exists. Low church theology and political socialism are it's a very common connection here. Well, Frank Knight was absolute eclectical thinker. He didn't have to describe his ideology is absolutely impossible. He has some classical liberal influences, but some very anti-liberal influences, and some Catholic influences later on, religious thinking. His ideological worldview was a mess in the sense that you cannot make heads and tails. So you see, they were not an ideologically coherent group, and insofar as there was any ideological consensus among them, with some kind of middle of the road eclectic political position, like a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican, something like that. Sometimes more to the left, sometimes more to the right, but they were not a uniform, ideologically a uniform group, and insofar as there were resemblances, they were more to the political left rather than political right. This is interesting because nowadays their results, their analytical results, economic results, are almost without exception taken as the most sophisticated economic, theoretical, and philosophical justification of the free market. Not only of the efficiency of the free market, but also of the ethical justice of the free market system. So that's another cautionary tale here that I will remind you. Another example of a cautionary tale that you shouldn't identify political allegiances of economists with their analytical results. Remember, Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill were liberals par excellence. They believed in minimal government and laissez-faire and so on. And yet their analytical results prepared the ground for Ricardian socialism and eventually for Karl Marx. This labor theory of value, rent, and all that stuff. By the same token, those guys were kind of semi-socialist, social democrats, middle of the road, left liberals, whatever you want to call them. And their analytical results, marginal productivity theory of labor, pure time preference theory of rent, the theorem of exhaustion of the entire social product, and so on. They developed the most sophisticated theoretical instruments that are used by libertarian philosophers nowadays to justify the free market system. One example that you never shake off is Robert Nozick. You might have heard about that guy. Robert Nozick is one of the most influential, if not the most influential, libertarian philosopher of the 20th century. He wrote his book Anarchy, State in Utopia in 1974. And in this book, he uses John Bates Clark and Wicksteed and It's the marginal productivity. He uses like a 60% of the argument against redistribution of income that he develops in the second part of his book. It's just taken from this tradition. And he was by no means the only example of that. And I think that Frank Knight and Philip Wicksteed would like the way how Robert Nozick and Murray Rothbard and Mises and everyone nowadays, whenever somebody wants to increase the minimum wage, what is the predictable response? You stupid economic ignorant, you don't know that marginal productivity determines wages. That's how the wages are valued. If you increase the minimum wage, that's the unemployment will resolve. John Bates Clark proven that in 1891. You don't know that. So the same thing, and they would probably shy away from subscribing to the ideological interpretations of their political. But that's the way it is. Adam Smith and David Ricardo would probably also shy away from their Marxist ideological interpretation of their own thought. But interestingly enough, I think both Marxists and both radical libertarians nowadays are right. You cannot, there's a deeper truth here that you cannot control the results that you reach. That you cannot control. The authors don't always have the best grasp of the true meaning of whatever they happen to be writing. Only the historical context in passage of time can show this best possible meaning of a given theory, and our authors here are not the exception to that. So you should be kind of prepared for this seeming inconsistency, for this tension between their professed political and ideological views on the one hand, and the analytical results of their economic theory on the other hand, that sometimes go sharply against what you would have expected from somebody with social democratic allegiances to come up with. Okay, so this is just the introduction. Read a little bit about all of them in those handouts. I sent you the website. You can find a lot of very useful material. Maybe if you decide to write a final paper about any of this, you have quite a bit of useful material. It's a very good bibliography. So, this website, I think the guy who did this website is professor of economics himself. So that helps explain the relatively high value of the information that you get here. So I will post also the readings for Tuesday. I'll try to reduce it to maybe 20, 30 pages at the most, in addition to the chapter 3 from the book that we read. And for a while we will be busy with Anglo-American followers of the Austrian school. Okay, any comments, any questions? Okay, so I don't insist for you to read the first two chapters. I would just recommend you to read chapter 1 here, because it kind of lays out the basic argument why should you worry about all of these guys. And later on, the primary readings are the ones that I will post. The book will be just a help to provide you with some context, maybe with some clarification, but the primary stuff will be those shorter readings that I will post. Okay then, let's call it a day if there are no further questions. Have a great weekend all, and I'll see you all next Tuesday.